liberal realists tend to minimize the degree to which the system is genuinely dysfunctional. While at the same time, Marxists tend to minimize the degree to which the system is durable across time. And I thought, what if we put these two thoughts together, that the system is truly terrible, really genuinely miserable for most of the people subject to it, but also that doesn't mean it's going anywhere because the liberal realist arguments about its durability and the strengths of the institutions are also very compelling.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Class Unity Speaker Series event. My name is Andy Schaefer, and I will be facilitating our conversation today. Class Unity is a Marxist organization that supports class struggle politics here in the United States. We believe in class politics, not identity politics. Our ultimate aim is to help build a coalition that would establish a workers' party here in the United States. If you'd like to support us, please consider giving us a donation, or even better, by joining us. You can do either by going to our website at www.classunity.org. Before we get started, I just wanted to plug a few upcoming events. On Saturday, June 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we are speaking to economist Radhika Desai to discuss her new book, Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, as well as her paper, Geopolitical Economy, the Discipline of Multipolarity. In addition, on July 7th, we are starting a new reading group to discuss the 2008 financial crisis. The goal of this reading group is to help attendees understand the political and economic forces that shape financial crises and how the modern state responds to them. We would highly encourage everyone to attend this reading group. We think it's going to be a good one. This reading group is open to the public, so you do not have to be a Class Unity member in order to attend. If you are interested, please go to our website, and again, that is www.classunity.org, where you can sign up for the course and join our mailing list. And again, the first class starts on Sunday, July 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be meeting each Sunday thereafter. Now for the main event. Our political education program is concerned with promoting materialist analysis on politics, economics, and social issues. Part of that program is our speaker series. Today, we will be speaking to Dr. Benjamin Studebaker. He is a political theorist and writer who teaches and publishes in both contemporary political theory as well as the history of political thought. He has a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. His work includes various articles and academic publications exploring topics such as political legitimacy and the nature of the state. He has also published various op-ed pieces for political magazines and media publications such as the Huffington Post, Current Affairs, New Republic, Compact Magazine, and Sublation Magazine. Finally, last year he released his first book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and he is also releasing a new book scheduled to come out in November of this year titled Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. Today's conversation will be centered around that first book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut. The book explores why the United States political system is stubbornly stable despite its increasingly obvious inability to solve chronic structural problems that are relevant to average Americans. Dr. Studebaker, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. Just to get us started off, could you introduce your book? What is your book about? What topics do you explore? And finally, why do you believe that the way is shut?
Thanks a bunch. It's great to be here. The Way is Shut really is an attempt to contextualize this crisis of American democracy within the economic system. I think one of the things that's gone badly wrong in the American academic scene in recent years is that the democracy problem has been siphoned off and treated as a separate thing that exists in a cultural universe that's to do with the internet and gatekeeping and cable news and the media and who's talking and what they're saying. And it's become totally alienated from the context in which all of that occurred. And being over at Cambridge, I noticed that in the UK, in Europe, the Euro crisis, the crisis of the European Union, always economic issues are talked about in relation to that. These things are never taken apart and treated as separate or unrelated. So one of the things I wanted to do was to take some of this European literature and European perspectives and apply them to the United States. Another thing I wanted to do was to put Marxism in conversation with liberal realism, because I think liberal realists tend to minimize the degree to which the system is genuinely dysfunctional. Well, at the same time, Marxists tend to minimize the degree to which the system is durable across time. And I thought, what if we put these two thoughts together, that the system is truly terrible, really genuinely miserable for most of the people subject to it, but also that doesn't mean it's going anywhere, because the liberal realist arguments about its durability and the strengths of the institutions are also very compelling. So it begins with an exploration of the American economy. The first chapter is mainly about capital mobility and its effects. As it becomes easier for money to move around the world, that gives the people with money more leverage. And the people who don't have money, the people who are stuck in place, who can't easily immigrate from place to place, they have less leverage. Territorial states have less leverage because they are fixed in place. And so that means that states are increasingly making public policy on the basis of what's competitive for attracting this mobile money. And that results in lower taxes, it results in lower wages, it results in all sorts of deferential behavior on the parts of states when they deal with oligarchs, and fear that if they do anything to challenge this system or this distribution of wealth and power, that there will be enormous political consequences. There will be capital flight, there will be runs on bonds, runs on currencies, there will be defaults, there will be organizing that rich people will throw loads of money into the political system and try to get them voted out. And because of this, even though these changes are subjecting people to an enormous amount of stress, and I go through the stress that the workers experience, what professionals with college degrees experience, what small employers experience, even though they're all under a lot of stress, the government can't do very much about that stress, and the political professionals can't do very much about it. So they have to find ways to get people to understand this problem in terms that allow them to appear to be doing something about it. So they try to pivot it in a more cultural direction to make it seem as if the things that they are capable of doing remain relevant and tractable. And so as we move into the second chapter covers the left, the right, and the center, and the specific kinds of responses that each of those movements have to this crisis, and the ways in which the media environments that the left, the right, and the center exist in, the economic constraints that they face, the magazines face, the academics face, the universities face, these things limit to a great degree what they're able to talk about, how they're able to frame things. And a consequence of this is that increasingly all of this content is search engine optimized, it's social media optimized, it's algorithmically optimized, which means it tends to be emotionally inflammatory. The effect of this is that all of these movements have become very, very focused on finding enemies and people to blame for what's going on as ways of avoiding dealing with the structural issue altogether. And so on the one hand, you have people who are blaming out groups, people who blame racial minorities, immigrants. And then on the other hand, you have people who blame the blamers, people who blame the deplorables, the bigots, the right-wingers. And in both cases, We are not talking about capital mobility. We're not talking about how to regulate it, how to manage it, how to disrupt it, either multilaterally or unilaterally. All of that completely drops out of the conversation, and we just have a discussion about culture. And this discussion about culture reaches its kind of highest level of screaming in the form of the argument about democracy and fascism and communism, where increasingly, if you can't convince people that you're actually going to do something to make their life better, what you do is you get them terrified that somebody else is going to install some kind of authoritarian government that's going to immiserate them even more than they're already immiserated. And so in the third chapter, I go into this discussion about this debate over the meaning of democracy. And because there's no agreement about what democracy means, the things that people do to try to purify democracy, to try to save democracy, these things all look potentially authoritarian to other people. People have different understandings of what democracy is for. They want different things out of it. And if what you want out of democracy is different from what someone else wants, they tend to think that you're an authoritarian. People also understand the problem of authoritarianism differently. Some of them understand the authoritarian as a single tyrannical ruler who makes arbitrary and capricious decisions. Others understand it in terms of a totalitarian, total society, impersonal system that makes decisions through incentive structures that are opaque and Kafkaesque and difficult for any person to grasp or modify or change. And these are very, very different ways of thinking about the problem of authoritarianism. And that leads to further confusion about what ways of dealing with democracy, what kinds of procedural reforms are genuinely emancipatory and which ones aren't. That's the first half of the book. The first half of the book leads up to that understanding of crisis. The second part of the book is a focus on possible responses, possible things that might be done. The fourth chapter focuses on the terms that we use to express our values, to express our dreams about the political, and how these terms are being watered down and modified to make it easier for us to accept what's going on and harder for us to articulate problems that we're having with it. But I also emphasize in that chapter that that discussion is heavily restricted to the universities and to the professionals. It's not something everybody participates in. It's not something everybody's comfortable with, and it doesn't include a lot of values that are important to many people in the population. My fifth chapter is about what happens to people who aren't part of that conversation, who don't get involved in those university debates about liberty, equality, equity, representation. In that fifth chapter, I argue that people eventually go into a kind of despair about politics that drives them to look for satisfaction in the private sphere. And I lay out 4 different F's that they can retreat into: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism. Of course, the more people try to get out of politics, the more incentive political professionals have to try to find ways to politicize these zones. So that chapter is very much a story of people who are in despair, going to the F's, trying to build other kinds of seemingly non-political institutions and structures, finding that politics finds them in those places, that they can't, have the resources to make the kind of family they want to make, that the professional preachers in their churches are politicizing their religion and trying to force them to vote or get back involved in politics, that their fandoms have the same kinds of cultural antagonisms that exist in the rest of public discourse, that tech companies and billionaires are, of course, immediately politicized as soon as they accidentally do anything which has any kind of impact on political discussion or on political events. So it's very, very difficult for people to stay outside of politics. And so they're repeatedly dragged back in over and over. And I make this argument that this part of the population is a kind of subaltern, that it can't really speak in politics, that a lot of the concepts and terms and language that we use at university, this stuff doesn't really do anything for these people or mean anything to these people, that increasingly these people are just trying to avoid dealing with college-educated university people and their political terminologies. And that this results in a kind of hiding, that increasingly there's one part of the population that is trying to make a living by talking, and another part of the population that is trying to avoid dealing with the people who are trying to make a living by talking. The kids these days, I think, call them the yappers, right? So the final chapter, the 6th chapter, goes, okay, well, what if this book is wrong? What if I am being too negative in the way that I'm framing all of this? After all, in the United States, we have this proud tradition of mandatory positivity. You can't be too negative about anything, or people say that you're a killjoy or that you're not trying to contribute to solving problems. So I run through kind of a steelman version of reformism and a kind of steelman version of revolutionary position. And I play around with those positions and I try to, try my best to articulate the strongest possible reformist position I can and the strongest possible revolutionary position I can, and explore the difficulties and problems that come up even with steelman versions of those positions.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great summary. Um, so now I think we can move on to the Q&A portion. So I would invite the audience now that if they have any questions, that they can please type stack in the Zoom chat window. And once we get enough stacks on the list, I'll start calling people. So while we wait for our audience members to come up with their questions, I'll go ahead and start off by asking my own question. So one of the parts of the book, particularly chapter 2, that I thought you articulated very well was you've already kind of discussed some of this, but you talked about um, basically how the left has adopted a failed strategy for trying to get more of its members into Congress. And that part of this has to do with that they're incentivized to favor cultural issues rather than economic issues. So the classic example of this would be Bernie Sanders had a more economically populist 2016 campaign, as opposed to his 2020 campaign when he started tailoring his message more towards colleges. So also the left has reinforced this strategy by specifically targeting primaries, Democratic primaries in hyper blue districts, which necessarily means that they're going to be trying to appeal to these same type of voters, which is just going to end up alienating non-college educated working class voters. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about, oh, and sorry, one other detail about the right. So you also discuss how the right has been able to successfully exploit the resentments of voters left behind by our economic system by redirecting those resentments towards decadence narratives. So I think it's, for any political organization, I think it's really important to understand these dynamics. So I was hoping you could dive into more detail about what these decadence narratives are coming from the right, and also why we see left professionals leaning into these cultural issues, even when they are themselves victims of the economic system. You talked about a subset of them being what you call fallen professionals. So basically, you go to college, and then after college, you end up working at Starbucks. So I was hoping you could discuss those.
Yeah. So this would be a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about class as I set it up in the book, because I do have an explicit class analysis, which I think there isn't a ton of these days in mainstream academic stuff. So I break it up. The workers for me are employed, they've got a boss, and they don't go to college. The professionals are employed, they've got a boss, they do go to college, and the employers don't have bosses, they hire people. That's my basic schema. And then within the professionals, I make a division between the fallen professionals, the professionals who go to college but don't get the economic benefits, and the rump professionals who still get the benefits that were promised to everybody who went to college originally. Rump, kind of like rump state, the part that's left over after you shave off some chunk, right? So the fallen is what's shaved off, the rump is what is left. Within the employers, I make the distinction between the small employers, what we might call the petty bourgeoisie, and the oligarchs, who are, of course, the only people who genuinely benefit from any of this. So the fallen professionals, because they go to college, they get a level of cultural socialization from that experience, but they don't get the benefits. So when they are proletarianized, they don't really want to fully accept this proletarianization, because to fully accept it would be to say that going to college was for nothing, that the student debt, the tuition that was paid, that it didn't accomplish anything, it didn't cause them to be in a different job, different position. And this is made harder by the fact that colleges and universities are increasingly job factories, job coupon factories. They're not giving you some other kind of higher set of benefits apart from these jobs and a little bit of cultural seasoning on top of that. So it's difficult to say, okay, it's fine that I went to college because I learned things and became smarter and more well-rounded. Universities aren't doing that in the way that they maybe used to be thought to do that. And so there's only this little bit of cultural seasoning that people get that they can then hang on to and say, okay, this is why I went to college. It may not be that I got a better job. It may not be that I make more money or that I can afford a nicer house, but I understand that racism is bad, sexism is bad, homophobia is bad. These things are unacceptable. Settler colonialism is bad. Imperialism is bad, whichever particular constellation of terms, right? But there's a way of talking about politics and a way of being on the left that comes out of that experience and participation in student organizations on campus that people hang on to when they are proletarianized and they're put in the workforce environment. And a way for them to get the upper hand within these organizations that they participate in is to use this language to gatekeep and push out people who are not fluent in it. And I call this process whereby fallen professionals take over left-wing organizations and push workers out, McGovernization, to reference what actually happened in 72 with the McGovern campaign, where the McGovern campaign took a set of positions on civil rights, on Vietnam, that were compelling to people on university campuses, but also tended to have an alienating effect on workers and caused a large section of workers to vote for Nixon. And many of those workers never really came back to the left after being pushed over to Nixon. So I think that's a big part of why there is this desire on the part of a lot of fallen professionals to maintain this cultural distinction. Even though this cultural distinction limits the reach of their movements, it is genuinely really upsetting, I think, to go to university and not get the benefits that you were promised. It's really, really upsetting. And it has a very harsh psychological effect. People very much, especially young people in the country today, identify with being a gifted kid, being an honors student, being someone who's good at school, being someone who does what they're supposed to do. And when you don't get rewarded for doing what the system says you'll be rewarded for, people, I think very understandably feel resentment about that. But that resentment is very easy to direct in this hostility to the deplorables, to the racists, bigots, and bad people. And that makes it very difficult for there to be dialogue between the workers and between these fallen professionals, and it stops them from uniting. And it means that organizations, as soon as they get a few fallen professionals in them, tend to become completely overrun by fallen professionals and to exclude worker perspectives completely. And of course, the left media, which is made principally by rump professionals, people who have made it to some degree or other, that media tends to be made for fallen professionals rather than for the working class as a whole. Most of the people who are reading or watching left-wing media content are people who went to college and are fallen professionals rather than workers in the sense of did not go to college. So as a consequence of this, there's a symbiosis between the rump professionals in left media and in the left academy and these fallen professionals. The fallen professionals always wish that they could be like these rump professionals, and they follow these rump professionals as a way of staying connected to the university experience, to the culture that they got from going to university or living for a time in a big city. And very similar to, this argument gets made all the time about how some workers or some small business owners identify with oligarchs, identify with Elon Musk, identify with Andrew Tate, these hustler business people, and because they would like to be like them or they'd like to have that kind of life. The same kind of thing goes on with fallen professionals and the rump professionals in the universities and in the media. So I think that's a big part of the picture. Another part of the picture is that the center is gatekeeping the internet and is deliberately trying to make it harder for people to make money by posting about politics online. And an effect of this is that the rump professionals who are still operating online don't have as much money as they'd like to have and aren't as secure as they'd like to be. So they're forced to be more responsive to the algorithm and to its demand for outrageous clickbaity content. That's not something they want to be doing in many cases, but it's something that they have to do to stay alive commercially because of the ways the internet has changed. And one of the sad ironies is that many of these same people argued for these changes as they were happening because they wanted to stop fascism and they believed that gatekeeping the internet was necessary to do that. So one of the effects of this is that it's also made the left media space online much less vibrant, much less intellectual, and much more outragey. And the most successful YouTube channels, if you look around, are the ones that engage in this kind of Trumpian screaming and screeching and all of the same stuff that we all used to say, that's not how we ought to be talking about politics online. Nevertheless, it can't be avoided because of the way our public discourse is structured as a market and the fact that we have people who make money, make a living by talking about politics, political professionals. It becomes very important that the way that those people make a living is compatible with a discussion that is useful or generative. And right now, that's just not the case. On the issue of decadence narratives, so on the right, one of the favorite tactics that the right has for avoiding dealing with the economy is to instead say that all of the problems come from the fact that people aren't trying hard enough, or that they're not virtuous enough, or that they've succumbed to various vices, sloth, gluttony, greed, vices. And this emphasis on vices means if you're not doing well in this economy, it's your fault. You have to look at what you could be doing better. You have to do life hacks. You have to clean up your room, make your bed. You've got to watch these influencers who will tell you how to make a bunch of money. You have to go to Hustlers University, whatever it is. There's some kind of narrative about how you've got to overcome the various flaws that you have. And if you do, you'll be successful. And their evidence is that some people in the system are successful. Some people in the system become oligarchs. And therefore, if only you were as good as those people are, then you too would be an oligarch. And one of the sad things is that many of the people on the right who make this kind of content have also, to some degree, internalized it. They feel that these vices that they have, which themselves come out of capitalism, because capitalism is constantly inducing us to consume in ways that are harmful to our health and well-being, and which distract us from the things that we really value and the projects we really care about. Many of these people internalize a kind of self-hatred as a consequence of not being as successful as they'd like to be, not being Elon Musk, not being Bill Gates, not being these figures. They become extremely resentful on this basis. And this is a resentment that, again, is very cliquey and very tractable for people who make digital content. So it crowds out other more complicated narratives, which might embed these critiques of, say, consumer culture in an understanding of Marxism or capitalism or the economy. So, we used to have, the left used to be the space where there were all of these insightful critiques of the consumer society or the consumer subject. But all of this is outcompeted by right-wing decadence narratives that marry this to a kind of meritocratic hustler narrative.
Gotcha. Yeah, I always thought, I thought in the book in particular, you mentioned that that in the strange way, conservative values today are some actually in a way kind of don't align with market logic as much as progressive values. because of the need to split up the population into different groups of people that have to be pluralistically recognized marries very well with market logics in a way that uh, conservative ways of thinking about these things do not. Um, but they tend to be the biggest champions of the market. So I thought that was interesting. Um, so we've got one question on Stack. Hef, I'll call on you.
Yeah, thanks. My question was actually about capital mobility, but I think I'd like to ask a follow-up on your description of the classes. Uh, Class unity has had a lot of experience on the left in the DSA and the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we've definitely learned about a lot of what you're talking about now through hard experience. Um, the first Bernie Sanders campaign, 2016, was very much focused on um, uh, policies that would universally benefit uh, workers. I guess all workers, including professionals. With universal health care and like a jobs guarantee, things like that. And I, I I don't know what happened. I wasn't so involved in the Bernie Sanders campaigns, but you know the narrative that I'm hearing that seems convincing enough to me is that um, his campaign, as it became more popular, it attracted middle class professionals who brought with them a lot of ideological baggage and sort of um, by force of numbers, steered his campaign off of the class message, the more universal class message, into more like narrow identitarian concerns, and that sort of derailed his campaign and made it less effective. And even the second time that he ran, you would expect it to be more effective, as he built up steam, but it was less effective in his second run. And in the DSA, at least when I joined, it was already totally taken over by, you know, um, like these subcultural, you know, like approaches in which, like the first thing you saw when you went into like a DSA meeting was these like really like symbolic gestures towards, like Native American land and people's gender identities and things like that. I guess I'm wondering how um how durable is this how long lasting do you think this phenomenon will be of fallen professionals um hanging on to their like cultural baggage? If this is a recent phenomenon, wouldn't you expect, at least in the course of a couple of decades, that you know um they'll lose hope even in their cultural um their cultural assets? um is this just like a moment, like a certain moment in history that like happened once and is not going to happen again, or do you think there's something more long lasting going on?
Yeah, I remember, I think it was around 2019, all the talk on Twitter was pushing Bernie to the left. We've got to push Bernie to the left, by which they meant get him off of the economy and have him talk about identity politics. Yeah, I think that the problem here is that one of the moves the New Left made in the 60s and 70s was this idea that if you sent everybody to college, then everybody would be socialized to think. And if you just got everybody to go, then that would produce a population that was much more amenable to the New Left positions on culture war issues. The difficulty is that it was not the case that we generated more and more high status jobs for people with college degrees. We did not generate enough high status jobs to keep up with the number of people who are going. Nevertheless, if you want a chance at a high status job, you have to go. And so many people do go that there's a huge set of jobs that shouldn't really require a degree, but now do, simply because there's plenty of people to choose from who do have degrees. Why would you pick someone who doesn't? The effect of this is that everybody has to go, almost without exception. Some people get away with not going, but overwhelmingly now, nearly everybody's got to go. And if nearly everybody's got to go, but capitalism cannot generate enough high status professional jobs, then we will continuously create large numbers of fallen professionals. Ever larger numbers of them will be every year machined out by this system. And this problem could go on for a very long time. I think a lot of people in the New Left imagined that we were transitioning rapidly to a kind of post-work economy, that it was going to become possible for many, many people to not be in labor. I think they took the welfare state in the 60s for granted, thought that people would have options when they left university, apart from competing ever more vociferously for a small and limited number of high-status jobs. So they didn't realize the negative subjectivity that would be created by sending large numbers of people to university without giving them any kind of plausible path by which they might make a living by talking.
Thank you. Zach, you are next.
Hi, thank you for talking with us tonight. Really enjoying this speech, and I enjoyed the book. I guess, it's hard to find, it's hard to look into the future. And one of the things you say in the book is kind of looking towards, a lot of people on the left want European style reforms, but they're kind of really having the same crises there that we are here. So those aren't, going to be particularly helpful in a situation. I mean, is there any, like, outside of the US and Europe, are there any countries where you think there are positive trends for, democracy, for, economic justice in a country, like outside of the US and Europe?
I think the past is something that we are always wanting to go to. We're always wanting to go to the past, or to go to some place far away that we don't know a lot about, that we can have rose-colored glasses about. And I think that's one of the kinds of hope that I think we have to overcome to be able to do something better here. But I think, we shouldn't be too downcast by that, because when people were doing the bourgeois revolutions, all of society for hundreds and hundreds of years had been feudal and miserable in all kinds of ways. And they weren't discouraged by the fact that they couldn't look around and find a society that was around at that time that was better. They just looked and, they read a bunch of classical texts about Greece and Rome, and tried to remix those things in ways that suited their own circumstances. And they were happy enough to do that. I think that that's kind of what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to come up with new ways of combining all of the different things that are inherited from human thinking to find new ways of approaching our situation. But that will start by abandoning the hope that comes from looking at the past or looking at other parts of the world, especially the third world. I think it's become really popular to look at underdeveloped states, kind of read a few magazine articles about them, convince yourself that they're paradises or that they hold the revolutionary subject. And this can become a really, really efficient way of avoiding dealing with the situation. So that would be my justification for the answer, which is no, I don't think that there's a country out there that offers wonderful hope at this time.
Hef, you're next.
I wanted to ask about capital mobility and the role that it plays, the leverage it gives to employers over workers. If I understand your argument correctly, it's because companies can easily move operations from one state to another, from one country to another, that governments are forced to cater to their needs in order to retain their investments in their geographical areas, so that a government worries that if it adopts a policy that benefits working people over employers, then employers will respond by moving elsewhere. Uh, I I agree that that's a big part of what's happening, but I wonder um, if a government really wanted to uh, stand up to the power of capital owners, uh, doesn't it have resources at its disposal that would make it more independent financially from capitalists? For example, if a government, if a state or a country had its own sovereign currency, it could spend and create its own industries so that it wouldn't be so reliant on private investment. Um, Maybe as a follow-up later, I'd like to ask about uh, the phenomenon of de-dollarization in other countries sort of trying to build up their own industries in response to American imperialism. I feel like that has to do with it. But maybe just on that question of um, uh, don't don't countries have um, you know a set of options if they really wanted to um, resist the leverage that capitalists have um, uh, with capital mobility.
Yeah, so part of the trouble from a currency standpoint is if you want to launch a new currency, you have to convince your population to hold the currency. So they have to believe that the currency will be stable. And one of the things oligarchs are really good at is undermining people's confidence that the currency will be stable by selling off huge amounts of it or by jacking up the bondholder rates on government debt for that country. So a straightforward example would be Greece during the Euro crisis, where Greece very seriously considered reintroducing the drachma. The trouble was that there weren't a lot of economists in Greece who felt confident that they understood currency theory well enough that they could manage the introduction of the drachma in a way that would not be devastating to the value of the currency. And even the economists that thought it might be possible to do it, they acknowledged that in all likelihood there would be a drop in the value of the drachma from the moment it was introduced that would be sizable. And even if you did the best that you possibly could to contain that drop, the effect of that drop would be that overnight there would be a reduction in the real value of everybody's assets as soon as they're drachmized, right? And once that happens, then the currency is associated with becoming poorer, which means people aren't going to want to hold it, and there will be a black market for other currencies that are considered more trustworthy or more stable. And over time, you could gradually get people to hold the drachma. It can be done, but the initial upfront cost of that economically is very politically expensive. And that's one of the things that scared Syriza off it.
As a related follow-up question, while we're on the topic of capital mobility, in the news recently, a few weeks ago, the Biden administration announced a new round of tariffs on China. In particular, um, the tariff on EVs in particular was kind of extraordinary, over 100% for electric vehicles. And then smaller tariff increases, but still substantial for, I believe it was steel and aluminum and other commodities. So you also mentioned in the book Trump, beginning this process that, Biden originally rhetorically was opposed to, but now he's, in terms of protectionist policy, it looks like he's adopting identical stances to Trump. But you mentioned Trump increasing tariffs on China, but that really his efforts were half-hearted, and that really that just caused exports to increase in other Southeast Asian countries. You mentioned Vietnam was able to make up the difference. Do you think the dynamic is essentially the same with these recent tariff increases by the Biden administration, or do we think that this is just a way to save face with voters before the election without really substantially changing the dynamics of trade between the United States and other countries.
Yeah, so I would say that I think the Biden administration does want to increase the industrial capacity of the United States, particularly for national security reasons. And it's embarked upon a militarized Keynesian strategy of using the war in, for instance, Ukraine to fund the growth of military-related industry in the United States. So technology and industry that is considered sensitive for national security reasons, the Biden administration does not want us dependent on Chinese imports for that stuff. That does not mean that the Biden administration is interested in undermining capital mobility around the world or in starting a war with China that would disrupt Pacific trade. I think the real goal of the United States, and this goes back to Obama and TPP, Obama tried to do it with carrots, Trump switched to sticks, and Biden is stuck with sticks. Really, the idea is to make sure that the countries that the United States is trading with in Asia are allied or friendly countries. And ideally, they should be countries with US military bases from the point of view of the administration. So there's an effort to make a ring of friendly states around China, get trade with all of those states rather than with China, get military bases in those states so that if necessary, some kind of containment strategy can be pursued in Asia. That's the pivot to Asia from the Obama administration that has just been going on slowly for more than 15 years now.
Makes sense. Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can go back to some other questions. Hef, I see you got a follow-up.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this point of capital mobility seems really important to me. So if I could just ask a follow-up. I think, yeah, you wrote this book very recently, but even since your book was published, I think, like, the world is moving fast now, and I think, like, events, in the global scene are progressing pretty rapidly. Recently, U.S. spokespeople have visited China, urging them to, I guess, basically with concerns that Chinese, they call it overproduction, would lead to them dumping their goods into competing markets. Basically, the United States is worried that China is going to outcompete with them in global production. It's not clear where these developments are headed. It could be a trade war in which each side sanctions the other and builds up his own industries. If that does happen, maybe the point of that won't be to increase the power of the industrial working class, but that might be an effect. If the U.S. reindustrializes, that could lead to stronger union leverage. If we do see a trade war, American consumers would be corporations based in the United States would rely more on U.S. consumers if they can't rely on international consumers as much. So I think these do seem to have an effect on the questions that you touch on in your book. Do you think do any of these recent developments have you changed your mind about anything, or is there anything that has surprised you given recent developments, or has anything affirmed your the arguments that you've made in your book?
Yeah, the Biden administration does seem to have been influenced by that Michael Pettis, that Pettis-Klein book, Trade Wars or Class Wars, which I cite in the book. And that is the argument that they're referencing when they talk to China about Chinese overproduction. In the book, I talk about how, to really keep the whole thing together and not have any kind of tension, you would have to have some kind of multilateral collaboration between China and the United States, in which China makes internal reforms within its economy, which facilitate a set of reforms within the American economy. Those reforms would increase the purchasing power and consumptive capacities of Chinese workers, which would mean more consumption overall, and that would damp down on the level of production competition that's going on. I think in the kind of worst case scenario, the most like China-phobic kind of US state that can't persuade China to do anything different in terms of its policy, decides it can't cooperate with China at all and decides to restart a Cold War, and cuts China out of the international system, effectively. The United States that tries to do that, the most you would get in that situation would be a world in which certain states that had become, from the point of view of the United States, pariah states, would no longer be able to engage in Pacific trade because the American Navy would start frustrating their abilities to do that, right? In that kind of Cold War world where there would be no trade between the American alliance system and a Chinese alliance system, there would not be very many states that would be in the Chinese alliance system based on where things currently stand. You would have Russia, you would have maybe a few other states in Asia. China has been trying to build railroad connections within Asia to create trade links that can substitute for Pacific trade, because China is not in a position to compete with the American Navy and Air Force in the Pacific. It could certainly repel an American ground invasion, but it's not capable of competing in the oceans with the United States. So a consequence of all of that is that I think we would have something that looks like the 80s. If we had something that looks like the 80s, where there's very little trade between the Soviet system and the American system, very little interaction, but an enormous amount of capital mobility within the American sphere, within the Western sphere, you'd still have a situation where the United States would import a lot, aside from things that are relevant for national security, because the United States would be rearming from the point of view of worrying about China. And so rebuilding its military capacity, its military industrial capacity in response to China. But all of the other stuff that's produced could be produced in any allied state, just as during the Cold War, there was an enormous amount of stuff that was produced in Germany and Japan. And that production gradually undermined the position of the American worker. That capital mobility that occurred within the Western sphere during the Cold War was the engine in breaking the organized working class in the 70s. So even in the 70s, where you had a much stronger labor union movement in the States, that was much bigger, that was industrial, that was factories, and it was 70s factories with much larger numbers of workers and a need for workers because you had much less automation. Even in that environment, with the Soviet bloc excluded from the system and with very little mobility between the Western system and the Soviet sphere, even then, there was enough capital mobility to overcome the labor movement of that time.
So if I could just clarify, specifically, at least on the phenomenon of de-dollarization, do you think that it doesn't, the process of de-dollarization is not a strong enough or promising enough phenomenon to you know I guess, do you think that it doesn't hold as much promise as its exponents argue that it does, or that the process will the process could result in I guess what the BRICS sphere is aiming towards, but that even in that scenario, you wouldn't have enough of a change in capital mobility to benefit U.S. workers?
I would say first that I think that it needs to be interpreted and understood as a defensive maneuver by a Chinese state that is worried about an American state that is increasingly rogue and increasingly unstable in its behavior and in its attitude to the global system that it's supposed to lead. The way that the Europeans and the Chinese are looking at this is that the Americans have become very unreliable. They're very unreliable. They say one thing when a Democrat's in office and a different thing when a Republican's in office. They increasingly seem isolationist and unwilling to bear the costs of maintaining the system, which to them seems crazy because they think we're the ones who have benefited from it more than anybody else. So there's a lack of trust in us. And so these states are increasingly developing contingency plans in the event that we do something really, really stupid from their point of view. And you can see this in the European press, where it's a lot of it is in English and easy to access, and you'll find the Europeans going, what do we do if Trump gets back in? We're going to have to start making a plan for how to, deal with possible US withdrawal from the region, right? In the same way, China is making a plan in the event that we try to do something to really mess them up. And it's smart for them to do that, and they should do that. The function of that plan is not to create a system that can totally displace the role that the United States currently plays. What it would do is it would mitigate the damage to the Chinese economy that would occur in this situation. And it would produce a viable secondary sphere, right? But it would produce a viable secondary sphere in the same sense in which, until the end of the 80s, the Soviet Union had a viable secondary sphere. That sphere was still much smaller than the American-led sphere. And because it was smaller and had smaller scale, it was harder for the Soviet Union to duplicate the internal reforms that we were able to do in the 70s and 80s to greatly reduce the cost of consumer goods within the United States. So we were able to, by buddying up with China in the 70s and afterwards, we were able to import an enormous amount of cheap electronics from Japan, cheap cars from Japan, cheap plastic goods from China. And this created this appearance of enormous abundance in the United States, which was propagandistically extremely effective in the 80s. And we were able to disseminate these images of American wealth in the 80s and 90s. Shows like Friends and Seinfeld that depict a ridiculously high standard of living for single young men. We were able to persuade people in many different countries that if they adopted a system that was like ours, that they would get these benefits. In truth, only a small handful of countries have actually been welcomed into the consumer cartel, countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. Right? But this is still, most states would much rather be in that consumer cartel and get the 30, 40% boost in GDP per capita that you get in a 30-year period by going into that cartel. The issue is we won't let most states into that cartel because the cartel is not big enough. You can't have every country in the world system be a consumer state. So only occasionally can you bring people in. And typically the way that they've decided about who to bring in is, which countries would you like to have some cheap labor from for the next 10 years? And if you don't want cheap labor because you're having issues with refugee crises, you're having issues with immigration as an issue in domestic politics, then you don't want to admit a new state, because when you admit a new state, there will be an influx of labor as people from that new state move to the richer states within the alliance structure for the opportunities that are available there. You'll get brain drain in that state as those people move, and then over the next 30 years, that country will become rich enough that you'll have less of that happening and less of that brain drain. You saw that, for instance, when Poland went into the EU and went into NATO. Initially, there was a huge movement of Poles to Western Europe to provide a source of cheap labor. And then over time, the Polish economy grew, and now Poland is in a more stable position. There's still a gap between Poland and Western Europe, but it's nowhere near as big as it was when Poland first entered. That would be kind of the way I would frame it. So certainly it benefits China to make a contingency plan, but that's not the same thing as displacing the American system with an alternative way of managing global capitalism. In extremis, you would get a secondary sphere that's smaller and weakened by its smaller scale that might be viable, that might be able to survive, but it would not be optimal for the states that are in that sphere. And Putin has made that point. Putin has said that if, he many, many times wanted Russia to join the Western sphere and get the benefits of joining, but Russia was always told that it could not be admitted.
Awesome. This is a great discussion. Nicholas, you're on Stack Next.
Hi, hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm in a slightly noisy environment here, so I apologize for that. But I did have a question. I know we were just talking about foreign policy and geopolitics, macroeconomy stuff. But I wanted to go back, if I could, to the question of class and class sort of distinction, specifically the question of the, I guess what we sometimes call the PMC. I noticed Benjamin was arguing that you know, a goodly portion of this class is effectively proletarianized. I'm wondering if he could perhaps go into some more detail on why the word proletarian is applicable to these otherwise sort of what we sometimes call PMC people. Because I've heard arguments and I've seen arguments that some people suggest actually the better way to describe these people is lumpen. And if there's I personally think there's something at stake in that. I think calling them lumpen, it gives a more accurate sense of, and I'm using Barbara Ehrenreich's kind of notion of lumpen here, but the idea there would be that, you know, that there's kind of mercenary tendency to these downwardly mobile PMC. As they're ejected out of their middle strata, they're heading towards a category that sort of forces them to become like a mercenary force. Now, Barbara Ehrenreich argued a long time ago that you know, that we, you know, that while that may be the case, we still need them, right, for the left. We still need to kind of try to recruit them. We can't win without them because they're very media savvy and they kind of know how to make a moral argument. They have a certain kind of intellectual capital that you know, in the right hands, it can be beneficial. But I'm just wondering, is that an over nuanced case from Benjamin's point of view, or is it something worth is it worth maybe debating through whether they're proletarian or lumpen for him?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I considered the concept of lumpen and the possibility of applying it, the possibility of where it would fit if I did apply it. One of the reasons I didn't use it is that I tended to put this book more in the language of liberal realism because there's a larger set of people who are fluent in that language. And I knew that if I used a term like lumpen, that would lead to more confusion. I think a lot of people associate the term lumpen with, say, drug-addicted, homeless people who have fallen out of society. And that's not quite what the fallen professionals are. Nevertheless, there are things that have been said about the lumpen by other theorists, like Barbara Ehrenreich, that do seem to apply to the fallen professionals. So I think you have a point there about those things. Yeah. The question is how to get that point across in language that can be understood.
Awesome. So wanted to shift gears a little bit. And we still got some more time. So if folks have more questions they want to ask, feel free to type in Stack. But just to shift gears a little bit, I particularly enjoyed chapter 4 because, you know, the way I read chapter 4 was you were essentially talking about ideology, but you were talking about ideology in a very approachable way that felt less mystical. You're really talking about different concepts that political actors can use to legitimize how the state is functioning. And the three terms that you gravitate towards were liberty, equality, and representation. These, in the American context, these are kind of the big three terms that all Americans have some kind of feeling towards or reaction to. And you've mentioned that political elites have attempted to water down these terms over time. My question for you was, first, if you'd like to elaborate on, you know, what these three terms are and what they mean in politics today. But also, do you think that these efforts are ultimately going to be successful? Those efforts being the efforts to water down these terms until people's expectations are lowered. And also, which of these terms, if any of them, do you believe that a political movement that is interested in raising expectations rather than watering them down is a more useful term? I, for example, am pretty partial to the liberty term over the other two terms, but I was curious what your thoughts were.
Yeah, that's also the way the platypus people react to that chapter. They like the liberty term. Yeah, so that chapter is really some of what I talk about there. I talk about in the next book that will be out in November, and I use this concept in that book, legitimating abstraction. So there are these big abstract values that are nebulous, that can be defined in lots of different ways. They can be conceptualized in lots of different ways. And these are the legitimating abstractions. These are the values that are invoked by the state to explain or justify its acts, right? All of those legitimating abstractions can be conceptualized in ways that might actually have this effect, might be legitimating for a subject. They can also be conceptualized in ways that appear as ideology to subjects. And I say that explicitly in that next book that will be out in November. So I argue that liberty, equality, and representation are the liberal legitimating abstractions. They're the abstractions that are at the center of liberal democratic legitimation strategies. That doesn't mean they're the only abstractions that are important. In that second book, I talk about folk legitimating abstractions, abstractions that came into politics earlier on in the history of people and have never quite gone away. Ideas like peace or prosperity or God or nature. These concepts also float around in our discourse and also perform these roles, and you will see political actors invoke these concepts from time to time, but they're not at the center in the way that, say, peace was very much at the center of Roman political ideology. You know, the emperor creates an all-embracing peace by defeating the barbarians. Now, there's an obvious ideological aspect to a claim like that. So I argue that legitimating abstractions have always been with us. As long as there have been states, there has been a need for these things. The audience for legitimation has varied. It's not always everybody. And in this book, I focus mainly on these terms to make the point that I think a lot of academics in the university setting have gotten this thought, that if they could come up with a better conceptualization of liberty or equality or representation, if they could come up with a way of convincing people that what it really means is something that would imply, say, socialism, that they could disseminate that idea through the universities. And then as a consequence of that, they could radicalize the public. And this comes back to this new left idea that everyone will go to university. So you make sure everyone is exposed to these concepts, and then you win the contest within the academy over how the term is understood and how it's taught, and then you disseminate it to the professionals, and then the professionals bring it to everybody else by McGovernizing all of the organizations. And eventually there's enough professionals that that doesn't create a problem. The workers are just become the fallen professionals, and all the workers are professionals. And there's no need to worry anymore about the cultural antagonism. I think that was the kind of new left vision. And I think this is a vision that we've seen in the academy at this point now for 60, 70 years. And you see it in the efforts to reconceptualize liberty, which a lot of the Cambridge School guys, got heavily involved with, Quentin Skinner, Raymond Goyce, who I cite in the book. And then with equality, you get this big debate about the currency of justice and different distributive principles. And I think what we have found is that, for one, the efforts to water down these terms from the Cold War that predate these interventions from the 60s haven't gone away. There's still a lot of universities where if you try to learn about liberty, you're just going to get Isaiah Berlin and positive and negative, and that's all you'll get. So for one, even Quentin Skinner, who is an enormously huge figure in the academy, I can't understate how important Quentin Skinner is to the history of political thought as a discipline. He's written book after book, article after article, complexifying the liberty debate in ways that are beautiful and which grad students greatly appreciate. Despite Quentin Skinner's lifetime of effort in that direction, it's still the case that in most American universities, you get this Cold War Isaiah Berlin account. So then I hear people going, what we really need to do is get away from equality and go back to liberty and get liberty defined correctly. And I go, but they already did that. The 60s generation already did that, and it hasn't worked. So I think that, by the way, that many of their concepts are really interesting, and normatively I'm very drawn to, especially the way Raymond Geuss lays out those 4 different types of liberty that are collapsed into one by Isaiah Berlin. I think Geuss did an amazing job there. One of the things that's kind of, I'm not sure, sad, or maybe it tells us something, is that Geuss had prepared to write an entire book about liberty I think it was in the 80s. And then he decided not to do that. He decided that it was a pointless thing to try to do, and he went in other directions. And I think that for a long time, this neo-Republican tradition has been trying to, and you can still see it in the journals, this stuff is getting put out all the time, trying to get us back to liberty and then get liberty understood in a way that's genuinely emancipatory. I think they have fought the good fight, but I don't think this is working. I think trying to do political change through the concepts that are taught at university is fundamentally a mistake. We're not going to be able to generate a consensus on any legitimating abstraction, any of them, and then use a consensus on that abstraction to radicalize the whole society all at once. I think that was a 60s delusion that we have to overcome, but it's a very compelling idea. And that's why this new left idea is still with us. And if anything, we still feel this compulsion to try to do it all over again.
As do I, apparently. Hef, I see you're on stack.
In your last chapter, you sort of paint a possible path to, I guess, building a dissident movement via what you call a para party. You don't think that a traditional third party is viable in the United States because of the way electoral law is set up, but feasibly you could have a party structure that would allow candidates to run on Democratic and Republican Party ballot lines, sort of what the left does, but instead of just the Democratic ballot lines, you could also run on Republican Party ballot lines. I guess why is this sort of structure something you focus on in your book? Why do you think it has so much more promise than the other avenues to building a movement that could be politically effective? And what do you think what do you see as its biggest barriers to success if it was to grow legs?
Yeah, one of the things that I think will always haunt everybody of my generation is this question of what if the Sanders campaign hadn't done that? What if it hadn't done what it did in 2020? And what if the DSA had been organized in a way that preserved a working class character and had prevented McGovernization? What if they had done everything in a strategically optimal way? And that's something that I felt I needed to wrestle with a bit in that chapter. And the way I wrestled with it was going, okay, imagine that I could have gotten these people to do everything that they should have done. What would have happened? And how far could it have gone? And what would have come up? So the third parties are, I think, very heavily limited by the laws that require, if you're going to get ballot access for many different kinds of offices, it's not necessarily every office in every state, but for many kinds of offices, especially prominent offices, you have to run primaries. And once you're running primaries, you're in this competitive environment where outside money can very quickly infiltrate the process and deflect it in various different directions. You can't really do very much about that. That means that you're going to have to contest primaries, and it means you're going to need a bunch of money to do that. And the function of the primaries, I think, is to make all of the parties equally permeable by oligarchs. So no matter what you set up, as long as you have a primary, your party is permeable to oligarchs. So if your party is permeable to oligarchs, well, that means that your organization has to be something other than a party organization so that it can have a character that is protected from oligarchic intrusion. And that's where this idea of the para-party comes from. Something like the DSA, but not McGovernized, not professional class. So to do that, you would have to be institutionally, constitutionally set up in a way that prevents this McGovernization from happening. at the outset, you'd have to make sure that it doesn't always already begin that way. But then B, once you start to get some level of success and you start to win some seats, it's going to be difficult to pass a lot of legislation because you're not going to win all the seats all at once. You're going to be in the minority for a while. And during this period, there will be this need to stay relevant and convince people that you're doing something. And one of the political pressures that electeds face is this need to seem like they're accomplishing something when they're not. And in that environment, we've had this debate about, what should members of Congress who are ostensibly socialists, what should they do? And some of us say they should, call out the people who are in the way of what they want to do. And others say they have to work with the party to try to achieve something, no matter how small, because they've got to at least be seen to be practical. That debate has caused a ton of trouble. And I think that one of the ways that you could potentially deal with it is to have people committed to certain strategies before they even go into Congress, so that you can actually check their behavior against what they said they would do. Whereas now people are doing stuff and we're asked to back rationalize it or to accept their justifications after the fact. And there's this endless debate about whether they've been captured or whether they're being influenced by the party establishment. And no one really knows and no one can really prove it. And that whole discussion is energy sapping and debilitates us. So I think that's something that could have been done differently. I think ultimately a lot of what we can do if we do win elections is to do with housing and land, because that's fixed in territorial space. That's not mobile. Capital mobility doesn't influence that as much as it does other things. But very often movements start trying to do stuff that would work at the federal level but won't work in their state. Like if you try to do Medicare for all at the state level, no doctor is going to want to work in a state where the costs are controlled by the government. Doctors are going to work in states where they can get paid as much as the market will bear. So you'll get a doctor shortage if you do state Medicare for all, but you won't get that if you do national Medicare for all, because your doctors in the United States can't go to some other country and get paid more. Most other countries don't pay their doctors anything like as much as the United States pays theirs. And with visa restrictions and so on, it's hard to move, and language barriers. So that would be one straightforward example. I noticed that throughout the campaign, we had problems with people not understanding those distinctions, not being able to track, what is mobile, what isn't mobile, what can be done at one level versus a different level. So as I run through, and I think I came up with 10 different issues that the para party could face. And, even supposing you deal with those intermediary problems, there's then the question of what do you do at the end, right? Because if you try to do the multilateral strategy, what you typically find is that there aren't enough other governments with that are friendly to you. And if you try to make governments cooperate with you by threatening unilateral action, that tends, even the threat of it, even talking about it, tends to trigger economic problems and bond runs and currency issues and all sorts of political trouble. And so that, I think, is the really challenging question. You see with Mélenchon in France how hard that is to navigate. If you say, okay, we're not going to do anything unilateral, you get more votes because you seem responsible. But were he to win, would the Germans believe any threat by him to exit the European Union? Probably not. If he goes in the other direction and he says that we're going to pursue unilateralism, right away if people don't work with us, then he's not going to ever win the French presidency by talking that way, because it seems to people that the obvious consequence of that would be enormous near-term devastation, which people are very reluctant to vote for. So I think there's a lot of obstacles that come out of the nation-state system of having multiple different liberal democracies with elections on different timetables that are not influenced by each other. One very small reform that would help a little bit would be to try to time all of the elections in all of the countries, schedule them all so that they're the same day. Have all of the European countries run elections on the same day. That would be a procedural reform that might actually help somebody a little bit, so that you can actually sweep with the left in many states at once. But I do think that as I went through that section, what I felt persuaded by is that even if we had done everything right, it still would have been very difficult, and the odds are that we would have failed, and by a large margin. But I do think that that strategy that I discussed there is the best reformist strategy I can think of. It's the best reformist strategy I can think of. And if somebody is committed to doing reformism because they know they can't get themselves to do revolutionary activity, they can't get themselves to quit politics. I talk about, this person who, is just too magically political. You can't quit it. It's just ultimately life is meaningless without this, without politics, and without this struggle. If you are that kind of person and you're not able to be a revolutionary subject, I think this is the best thing you could try today.
Yeah, the point about the DSA really rings true. The class unity, one of the catalyzing events for us. We still have members in the DSA, but the explicit association with class unity is no longer there, and the railroad strike to force the contract on the railroad workers, and a lot of the squad members jumping on the bandwagon for that was a great example of just total lack of the ability to discipline elected officials by the DSA. So one follow-up to Hef's question I was just curious about, just because originally when I read it, I didn't know how I felt about it. I think it's plausible, but I kind of wanted you to talk through it. You mentioned the problem early stage of the para-party needing to build a power base, and part of the work for that is getting funding. And you mentioned really the only viable funding sources are the labor movement, which right now is pretty weak. And then the other funding source is essentially class trader oligarchs. And I guess I wanted to ask, because initially my reaction was, that sounds like a terrible idea, right? It just sounds like a way to have an oligarch take over your movement. All of a sudden you're reliant upon them. But I also understand the point that the labor movement is pretty weak right now, and there has to be some kind of imperfect catalyst to get, to get the process kicked off and started. So, yeah, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that thought really comes back to the idea that I think we must never forget, that the labor movement of the 70s was not materially strong enough to compete with capital mobility at the level at which it existed in the 70s. That, once you internalize that point, there is no possibility within our lifetime of constructing a labor movement that can perform this role by itself. The labor movement can have a role in it, but it can't do it by itself. And so then my question is, well, where else would you get the money from? And your point that you can't necessarily trust these oligarchs, because oligarchs that try to help workers are typically interested in power and in using worker movements to enjoy leadership roles. And once they get that power, you can't necessarily rely on them. All of that is true. And it's a huge problem. And it's one of the huge problems with the para-party proposal. All of those 10 problems, I think, are really serious problems. And each one of them individually could be enough by itself to be too much. And that's why I came away from it ultimately going, oh, the odds that this would have worked are extremely, extremely low. For one, most people who would get involved in a workers' movement, even if they were offered an opportunity to accept class trader oligarch money from a sincere class trader oligarch, would be too suspicious of such a person to take the money. Even if there was someone who really, really meant to help. And of course, you could play it the other way and go, well, how are you supposed to distinguish which class trader oligarchs are trustworthy and which are buying your movement? How are you supposed to do that? Wouldn't you be paranoid? And wouldn't there be class trader oligarchs who would deliberately deceive you as a means of course there would be some who would try to do that. So it's an extremely difficult thing to suss out. Extremely difficult. There's no easy answer to that one. And yet, I do think the point must be made that the labor movement will never be materially strong enough unless there is one of the four horsemen comes into play, right? One of the Scheidel, four horsemen of leveling, the things that sever capital mobility, that all of a sudden disrupt it in very, very massive ways. But we can't build our theory around one of those events because they're horrible and it's not okay to normatively advocate for them. Although, Lenin did. Lenin advocated for the imperial war to sever the capital mobility so that he could do the revolution. Lenin thought, oh, it's wonderful that it's inevitable because it will happen whether I want it to happen or not. And then said, just be ready for it, and built the whole Bolshevik movement around that. You could take that kind of attitude, but at that point, you are countenancing World War III.
Pretty bleak. Well, everybody buy your lottery tickets. Let's see if that works instead. All right, so I had one last question, then a closing question, but does anybody else have any, maybe we can take one other question if you have one for Dr. Studebaker. All right. I will. Yeah. So basically, my last main question, and then we'll have a wrap up question. So, obviously it's a pretty bleak book, and I guess I had a few related questions. So I'm going to try to articulate this best I can, and I'll let you kind of answer it the way that you think is best. So do you believe that embracing hopelessness and despair is better than embracing the politics of hope or fear? Does this get us anywhere better? So in other words, why should we read your book? And to be clear on the motivation of why I'm asking this, it's not for any kind of a dismissive intent. I personally found your book to be very clarifying and useful for my own purposes. And I do think understanding how the world works in and of itself is a benefit. But with that said, I have a close normie friend in my life. I'll be very vague, but they don't really, and I use the term normie as a compliment, not as a dismissive, but they aren't very deeply engaged in politics, but they're aware of this interview. And they basically asked me the question, why should I read this book? And it made me think about your analogy near the end about the political professionals that are in the hot air balloons. And, ideally, we want people engaged in politics. Unfortunately, you're going to need people in hot air balloons because you need people that have enough perspective on the macro conditions. But you don't want them floating so high up off the ground that they can't see the details of what's going on on the ground. And you also don't want, you want to be able to communicate with the people on the ground. So with that spirit in mind, I was hoping you could clarify why you think this book is useful, either for political nerds like ourselves or for the average American citizen that's not deeply engaged in politics.
Yeah, so I think that despair is a productive feeling when it clears out of the way stuff that's a waste of time, stuff that you shouldn't be doing, stuff that you should give up on. And I think that despair is a necessary human feeling to get us out of illusions. And I think there are a lot of people who are wasting a lot of time, and they're wasting money in many cases on stuff that is not going to help them. left-wing stuff, right-wing stuff, centrist stuff. And one of the big things that I would like this book to do for those people is to help them save their time, save their energy, save their money, and to not give it to stuff that is just leeching off of them, to not give it to professionals who are just leeching off of them, so that they can have that stuff for whatever it is that they decide ultimately to do with it. And one of the functions of that chapter about the Fs is to help people think about what to do with their time and energy if they don't want to do politics. You know, how do you get away from it if you don't want to do it? And if you do want to do it, how would you try something new or different that doesn't have these problems? If you're forced to confront the issues that all of these old strategies from the past have, and you stay engaged in politics, if you get all the way through this book and you go, no, politics is for me, I am, someone who can do no other, then the effect of this book will hopefully be to push you to develop a new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching this problem that are more likely to be tractable. To beat my book, to overcome it, you'd have to innovate, you'd have to be creative, you'd have to adopt a perspective or attitude to politics that would be really brilliant. You know, someone who could actually consign my book to history and go, that was stupid. To do that would have to engage in a really brilliant creative act. And I think that the kind of person who would get to the end of my book and still want to do that and actually succeed in doing it would be a wonderful person who would be making a real contribution to something. So the book is in part a challenge to that person to push them to do better and to do more. But it's also, to say to other people, you don't have to waste your time and energy on stuff that doesn't work. You don't have to spend your life that way. You are not under any obligation to engage in forms of politics that don't benefit you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think so. Garrett, I see your question. I think we've got time to take it. So go ahead. Oh, Garrett, you're muted.
Can you elaborate on the rejection you just made of Lenin regarding World War I? I don't believe I really understand it. My understanding was that Lenin actively opposed World War I, unlike the Second International Socialists. And I don't understand how it was immoral to, in your words, countenance the fact that the war was going to take place when that was an accurate assessment, and to plan for how to turn that into a revolutionary situation.
Okay, I didn't mean it in that kind of moralizing, normative way with respect to Lenin. So Lenin, in his theory of imperialism, said that this war is inevitable, it's going to happen, and when it happens, here's what we should do, right? So he believed the war was going to happen, and that when it happened, then people should refuse to fight, and that should be the basis for revolution, right? I'm not saying that Lenin did anything wrong in doing all of that, in just purely taking those positions. But I do think if we were to sit here and say we should try to bring about World War III, when that might not be something that's inevitable or necessarily has to happen, we should try to bring it about for the purposes of disrupting capital mobility because it might give us a chance. I would not feel great about making a normative argument for trying to start World War III. In the case
didn't
of
make
Lenin,
an argument for starting World War I, so I don't understand that.
I'm not saying he did. He argued that he doesn't have to make a normative argument for it because it's inevitable. However, I think before World War I, if you were to read Lenin's work on imperialism, or you were to read Hobson's thesis on imperialism, most people would go, well, we should try to prevent World War I if we can. That's something we should try not to have happen. And I think one of the reasons why people at that time didn't do that is that people at that time did not grasp how horrible that war would be, which is why so many people were willing in the end to fight them.
All right, thank you for
I
the.
remain a little perplexed. I suppose I have to read the book. I actually have not yet.
Thank you for your question, Garrett. Yeah, we think we're running out of time since we've got another engagement. So Benjamin, any final thoughts and a final idea to leave us with, and also anything that you would like to plug as well?
Yeah, I would just say, I think that there's a positive kind of despair that clears things out of the way and makes it possible to think in new ways. Don't go into the negative kind of despair where you internalize it and take it out on yourself psychologically. That doesn't benefit anybody. And I think a lot of the time when people don't want to read this book, it's because they aren't confident that they can keep those two kinds of despair separate. And I respect anybody who is in a position where they don't really feel like they can handle this book at this particular time for that reason. So I'd make that point, to somebody who's listening. If you are in a sensitive place, it might not be the right time in your life for this particular book. But I do think that it's possible, and I hope that people can have this kind of productive political despair without it poisoning your mental health or making you not want to be part of the world. In terms of stuff to plug, I do a couple podcasts, Political Theory 101. The Lack is my films podcast. You can find anything new I do at my website, benjaminstudebaker.com. That second book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracy, should be out in November.
Awesome. Well, again, Benjamin, thank you very much. Yeah, I look forward to your next book and future writings. And at that.